Welcome back to our online video Bible study on the book of Ezekiel. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at the vision that is given to the prophet Ezekiel by God in Ezekiel chapter 1. My name is Pastor Philip Hoppe, and I'm pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Colby, Kansas, and also serve as pastor at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Hoxie, Kansas. And I'm glad to be with you to continue to look at this oft-neglected book of Ezekiel. And as I mentioned, today we're going to be looking at the vision that is found in chapter 1 of this book. And this vision has so much imagery that's sort of wild that it can sort of get us distracted from what the main purpose of this vision is. And so we'll want to be careful not to get so distracted by the imagery itself so as to miss the main point. We will look at that imagery because it's certainly there for a reason. It's certainly there for a purpose, but we'll also want to kind of zoom out every once in a while and ask, why is this all going on, or what is this all pointing us towards? All right, we'll begin reading here in Ezekiel chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Kabar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Kabar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. As we read that part of Scripture, it's obviously this is sort of an editorial note at the beginning. That doesn't mean it's any less inspired than the oracles that will follow it, but it does mean that we should say here that there's sort of two main possibilities, which is one that Ezekiel himself wrote this beginning to his own oracles as he was collecting them together to be preserved, or secondarily, someone else that sort of followed in his tradition might have also collected these oracles and written this narrative part at the beginning. But whoever's doing the writing, they are certainly inspired by the Holy Spirit in such a matter that this introductory note is no less inspired than when God speaks directly through the prophet Ezekiel. It's just important to note there, but we want to now turn and look at exactly what are the details that are found there in that portion of Scripture. The first thing we'll mention is that we get a lot of talk here about the date and the time, right? We're told this was in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day. And the first thing we just want to notice how rooted in history this account is, right? This is not just, some vision, some dream that some guy made up somewhere and decided to write it down because he thought it was really wild and cool. No, this was a vision received in human history, and that's why the prophet Ezekiel gets very specific about when this vision was received. Well, what do we mean here by the 30th year? Well, most likely here, and scholars do disagree a little bit on this point, but most of them seem to think that this 30th year speaks about the prophet Ezekiel's life. In the rest of the book, indeed, most things are dated from the exile of Jehoiachin, which we'll talk about in a second. But here, this seems to be a reckoning of Ezekiel's lifetime, how old he is at the time this vision is received. Also, some people think this might also correspond that basically Ezekiel was born right at the time or very close to the time when the book of the law is discovered in the days of King Josiah. You might want to go back and reference that story, but that was such a critical moment when the southern kingdom takes a turn back towards God, and particularly for a priest like Ezekiel, that would have been a key moment. And perhaps he sees sort of his lifetime as beginning when that happens. And I don't say sees like he just makes that up, but that's the key event that was going on when he was born. That's all possible. We can't say for certain on those things. But also then we are told in this original 3 verses that this was the 5th year of the exile of Jehoiachin into Babylon. Again, you might want to go back and relook at that story in the book of Kings and Chronicles. But this story of Jehoiachin, he is exiled out into Babylon. And yes, there is another king who is sort of set up to rule as king, but the true Israelites always considered Jehoiachin to be the final king. And even when he is in exile in Babylon, he is still thought of as being the king. And so, and the reason behind that, I guess we should say, is that the whole idea of this king rests on the idea that this is the king in David's line. And so this is what the people are still waiting for. They're waiting for a return of Jehoiachin in one sense, but more properly speaking, a return of the Davidic king, in which Jehoiachin is one of those kings in the line. So it's a very important date during the exile period, because the exile is largely about kind of two main topics theologically. One, what about the Davidic king? And two, what about the land and the temple? I'll put those two together. Those are sort of the big questions about what does the exile mean for these particular promises of God. We're told here, and we mentioned this in the introduction, that Ezekiel is among the exiles. He's among the exiles at Chebar, and the word Chebar largely just means big river. We're also told that it's a canal so big that it would have been viewed by people as a river, and that certainly happens in the world in our day as well. But that's where he is seated. The first thing, though, is just to say that he is among the exiles. That is to say, he's living with them. He is not, like Daniel was, living in King Nebuchadnezzar's court or something. He is there with the other exiles that have been taken out. And that is where God has sent him to proclaim his words, his visions, all these different things, to do his sign acts. All of those will be done among the exiles. We're told also there that he's in the land of the Chaldeans. Chaldeans is just another word for Babylonians, the man who kind of is credited with being the one who created the Babylonian Empire. This would be Nebuchadnezzar's father. He was ethnically a Chaldean, and so those two terms sort of just get tied together at this point in history. So when you see Chaldean, you know that that's just another word for Babylon at this point. We can say geographically this would be near Nippur in southern Mesopotamia. And the last thing we want to note here is that he is at this river, probably for a particular reason, namely that we see throughout the scriptures that when the temple is not something that people can go to, either because they're not able to get there or because it does not exist, well, then the Jews seem to worship at the riverside. Why do they do that? Well, I mean, one way we can say the idea of water is all over the Bible as life-giving, but the other thing is the Jews had many different rituals which involved washing, and so if you needed to have a lot of water around for those ritual washings, the rivers were obviously a good place. You can see this in the book of Acts, right? When the apostles show up in a place, they often go out to the river to see if they can find Jewish people who are worshiping there. The other thing we're told here is that the heavens were opened. And when we look at that, we simply are reminded that this is sort of a way of speaking that God is making a revelation. It's sort of an idea that God is revealing something that's only known in heaven. Now he's going to make that known on earth. Or we might say, even better yet, that what is going on in the heavenly realm that's impacting earth, we get a clearer picture of what's going on. And that's probably very helpful for this book of Ezekiel, because this vision we give is going to tell us sort of what's God doing in all of this. Where is he? Is he still in Jerusalem? Is he not? Where is he? We're going to get some revelation about that, but the heavens sort of have to be opened up in order to see that. Interestingly, that specific phrase, which we do get in the New Testament, this is the only time that phrase is used in the Old Testament. The last phrase we get there is that the hand of the Lord was upon him. And this indicates simply that God is revealing something to this new prophet he has made, this priest turned prophet Ezekiel. God is here doing his work of revelation so that Ezekiel then can speak to those who are among the exiles. This is the same as saying the Spirit fell upon him and he began to prophesy. It's just another word that speaks about that same kind of idea. So that's sort of the occasion of the vision, right? Ezekiel is there with those exiles. He's there at the river, likely kind of worshiping there at the river. And all of a sudden, the heavens are open so that we can see what's going on in the heavenly realm. The hand of the Lord falls upon Ezekiel, and he begins then to speak to him this vision. All right, then let us turn to the actual vision itself, and we are going to read all the verses that contain the vision together right at the first, because I think especially with a passage like this where we're tempted to get distracted by the details of things, we do want to kind of just hear it once to try to pick up the bigger ideas. Then we'll come back through and look at some of the details that are present in the text. But let's go ahead first then and begin reading in verse 4 here. It says this, as I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. And this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands, and the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. As for the likenesses of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces, and their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies, and each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went without turning as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning. Now, as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl. And the 4 had the same likeness, their appearance and construction being, as it were, a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of their 4 directions without turning as they went. And their rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went, and when those stood, these stood, and when those rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Over the head of the living creatures there was a likeness of an expanse, shining like awe-inspiring crystal, spread out above their heads, and under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each creature had 2 wings covering its body. And when they went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, the sound of tumult like the sound of an army. When they stood still, they let down their wings, and there was a voice from above the expanse above their heads. When they stood still, they let down their wings. And above the expanse over their heads there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of the throne was a likeness with human appearance. And upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw it as if it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him. Like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. So hopefully as we hear that whole thing, we just kind of get the overall sense of what is going on here, that there is this grand appearance of this chariot, these angels, right? There's all this stuff going on, these creatures, but the whole thing speaks of sort of a majestic appearance, right, to Ezekiel. And Ezekiel will tell us that appearance was like the glory of God. So that's kind of the overall thing here, is that God is appearing to Ezekiel while Ezekiel is sitting there in Babylon. We'll return to that thought a little bit later. Let's turn now, though, to the sheet that I have prepared. All right, so the first thing that we end up hearing about is this storm that sort of comes. And we're told that this storm comes from the north. In Psalm 48:2, it does talk about Zion being in the far north. It's sort of a weird phrase since geographically it's not something that one would generally say about Jerusalem. But anyways, the psalmist describes it in this way. So it's possible this is just saying that this storm, which brings this chariot, is coming from Jerusalem towards Babylon. And that's certainly a big point of what is happening here, whether that exact detail is about that or not. The other thing that we can say is that in the scriptures, often when there are oppressive nations that God allows to come in to sort of wake his people Israel up, they usually come through the north, and that's mostly a matter of topography, that it's an easier way to get into the Holy Land there is to come from the north, or to get into, I should say, Judah and Israel, into Zion. It's the easiest way to get in. And so there might also just be a sense here that this storm with all of its fire and thunder is just a sense of judgment, right? That God is punishing his people. This time he will be punishing them through Babylon. But there's a possibility that's what the reference to the north is all about. Then we get these four creatures. These four creatures, who Ezekiel will tell us later in Ezekiel chapter 10, are in fact cherubim. The cherubim, you might remember, are the symbol of God's presence. The first time we see the cherubim is set there to guard the Garden of Eden after man is removed from the Garden of Eden. And the point there is sort of right, the Garden of Eden is still God's presence. It's where he's walking during the midst of the day. And so the cherubim is there. Also, of course, when we get to the times of tabernacle and temple and the Ark of the Covenant, that Ark of the Covenant, of course, has these cherubim that stretch out their wings and place their wings sort of straight out, as this text will say it, in order to sort of make a space for God. We'll talk about that a little bit more. We probably should say just in general that we want to talk about the number 4 in this section. Obviously, we have the 4 creatures and they have 4 faces. There's just a lot of foretalk. Well, generally in the Bible, foretalk is talk of sort of the wholeness of the earth, sort of as we would say in our world, north, east, south, and west, right? No matter which way you go. And that's the most likely reason we have this 4 here, is to kind of show again that God's activity is about the whole world. Again, that's part and parcel of why he's leaving Jerusalem and going to Babylon. Many of the other nations would have thought that impossible of a God to sort of go outside of his nation. But no, God's the God of all things and the God of all people. And so this chariot sort of gives that idea. When we get into the actual nature of these four faces, we are speculating a little bit here again about what this is all about. Early Christian interpreters sort of saw these four faces as symbols of the evangelists. They saw Matthew in the human face, Mark in the lion, Luke in the ox, and John in the eagle. And if you've ever studied those things, you know that even those designations kind of switched throughout Christian history, who was identified with what. But I think the basic idea was this fourness. Well, what do we have that has a fourness that would deal ultimately with sort of the proclamation of God going out? And so it was chosen to use these evangelists who were the gospel writers here. And so that's what we have here, perhaps, is a symbolism of that. Again, at least in early Christian thought, that was assumed. I've read others who think that perhaps this is sort of a picture of the ancient world and some of the main powers, namely Assyria, Persia, Greek, and the Greeks and the Romans. But if so, they're there under God's throne. And the point would be that God has control over all those nations. Why these creatures, right? Well, this is the best explanation I could find, and it makes some sense here. That the ox is selected as the chief of the tame animals, the lion is the chief among the wild, the eagle among the birds, and the man is the head of all, indeed, given dominion over all things. So again, this could just be sort of a separation of the creatures of the earth in a quick way, right? So that we've got, someone that is the head of all the tame or domesticated animals, someone that's the head of the wild animals, the birds, and then man watching over all things. We don't know exactly, but we do know that this four throughout the Bible indicates this thought of the completeness of the earth, whether we're talking about creatures or nations or the gospel writers who sent out the word to the ends of the earth. There's a sense here in which no matter which of those is sort of right, we get this idea that this message is ultimately going out to the ends of the earth. We're also told about these creatures' wings, these angels' wings. So they have four angelic wings here. Two, they sort of stretch out straight above to sort of almost give a platform. We'll talk about that for the throne of God to sit upon. And the others covering their bodies sort of in humility before God. But they're kind of how they are situated is sort of to give that place for God to sit, that throne to be placed where he is. And again, remember, wherever we see the cherubim, this is sort of the idea that God is present. And so they do whatever serves God being present, if that makes sense. The other thing we can note is that in Revelation chapter 4, these four creatures return again in the biblical writings. They're there at the throne of God in heaven as John sees it, although it's a little bit different in the sense that they're still the four living creatures, but each one has only one of the four faces, if that makes sense. So there is a lion, an eagle, a man, and an ox. I knew I was forgetting one. So we get all of those there, but separated. We can rightly say that the book of Revelation, especially in chapter 4, draws on a lot of the imagery that's here in Ezekiel chapter 1. And so as we're figuring out Ezekiel 1, we're also maybe figuring out how to read the things in Revelation chapter 4. The next thing we're told that is next to or by each of these living creatures, there are these wheels that are huge and sort of noticeable, right? They've got eyes all over the wheels, which is really just a sense that they see everything, they know everything. So it's just kind of an idea here that in the wheels, we're told, the spirit of these creatures. So the spirit of the cherubim is in the wheels. And yes, all of this is a bit confusing to figure out, right? But we get this idea that the whole chariot is sort of alive with the life of God, shown to us in the angels, shown to us in these wheels. And that we're shown that God is on the move and he can go any way he needs to very quickly. The other thing we'd say about the wheels is just as far as what they're made out of and their appearance, it's very heavenly, right? It's heaven touching earth when those wheels hit the earth. We're told, right, they rise up and they go back down. And when they hit the earth, it's heaven touching earth is sort of the idea there. We're also told of this strange construction that I don't believe anyone's ever built an axle to work this way. But you've kind of got one wheel going this way and the other wheel going this way. And the point of that is simply that then without turning, this whole thing can just move in any of the four directions that it needs to go. And we already talked there about, the eyes being there on the wheels. It's about being all seeing, all knowing, but it's also about it being alive. Those wheels are alive with the spirit of those creatures. The next thing we get is a description then of this throne of God. The throne, we are told, sits above or upon a firmament. You probably remember that word from Genesis 1 and 2, the creation account there of this firmament being placed in the heavens. And when you think about kind of how this is talked about and try to put it in a simple way, it's almost like in the heavens there's some sort of, I guess you'd say invisible, but some sort of dome or something. And many times it's sort of spoken of, at least, like that dome is sort of where the stars and ultimately God sort of rest. It's almost, if we could say this, it's the ground for the heavens, not ground in the sense of dirt and soil, but it's sort of a solid way up there in the heavens for things to rest upon or stand upon. And so we're told here, even on this little chariot, there's a little firmament there that serves that purpose again. And then we say, well, what is it that's resting on it? Well, it is the throne itself, which again, of course, carries God. So God is resting upon this firmament as well. We're also told that the angels or the creature's wings, they make this kind of thundering noise when they move about. We're told this is the noise of the angels, but he says here even it sounds like the Almighty. And so again, we do remember in Scripture that we are told that God's voice sounds like thunder. It sounds like lightning. We often think we're a little too sophisticated to believe such things. But we ought not go beyond what the Scriptures say and become foolish in trying to be so wise. And so, but the point here again is we have all these other things, but they're all pointing to who's riding this chariot, right? Who is there? The throne itself is said to be sapphire in appearance. And again, this is really to reckon that this throne ultimately comes from heaven, right? The beauty and the majesty of all these things speaks of the fact that this is kind of heaven coming down to earth. And then we're told there is a rider, and we're told he has a human appearance. And then we get these kind of details that from the waist up, it's sort of metal and fire mixed, and from the waist down, it's just fire. It's hard to know, again, exactly what all these details mean or are pointing to, other than just being a description of the vision, which is always possible too. It's just, that's what he saw, but it didn't necessarily mean anything to him either. But we get this idea that God here is on the throne. He has the appearance of a human. We should say with all this imagery, we kind of keep getting this idea of appearance. Why? Well, because this stuff is heavenly stuff, and you can't actually interact with that heavenly stuff that directly. We'll talk about that more in a second. But everything appears to be like something. It's like he's struggling to describe this vision in a way that us earthly humans could describe it, if that makes sense. But here's this fiery character, right? God himself riding on his chariot, coming towards Ezekiel, appearing there in Babylon, the place he's sort of not supposed to be, right? He's supposed to be in Jerusalem, but he is now forsaking Jerusalem because of the idolatry, and he's moving to Babylon. We also are told that there's this kind of brightness surrounding the throne, and we're told that brightness looks like a rainbow. And here we get kind of contrasting images, right? We get all this thunder and lightning and fire right there at the chariot. And yet in the backdrop is the rainbow, that symbol of God's mercy always. Again, in Revelation 4, we'll find a rainbow there present by the throne of God. And so there's always this reminder when we're dealing with our God, there is this scary, almighty side of God that if we were to just fall into his wrath, would be terrifying for us. And yet, God always too reminds us that his chief characteristic is that of being merciful. So even as you see this scary chariot coming towards you, the rainbows in the backdrop reminding you of God's mercy. So then kind of in summary, Ezekiel says as he beholds all of this, he says it was like the likeness of the glory of God. Glory is that outward radiance of God's nature. It's sort of what you see when God is around. And yet, remember, Ezekiel says here, it's just the likeness of the glory of God. Again, you can't behold the glory of God directly without, right, a covering, a blood covering, Jesus's blood ultimately. You can't just behold him directly. And so, again, we get this talk of the appearance or a likeness of something. But he does say, the point is the glory of God is coming. That phrase glory also, we should say, the Hebrew word there means something like weighty or heavy, but it just speaks about, that's why I like the word weighty. We use that too to mean kind of important, and that's kind of the idea. So again, this is what he says is there. In other words, and to say that the glory of God is somewhere is to say that God is somewhere. Final thoughts for today. I forgot one thing here. Finally, we are told that this voice speaks, and Ezekiel is humbled by this whole experience and begins to listen. Next time, we'll figure out what the voice says. But final thoughts then, all of this sort of shows us ultimately that the throne of God is on the move. It's on the move out of Jerusalem towards Ezekiel in Babylon. He's going from that place where his people were to gather, and now he's coming to be where his people, particularly his faithful, the remnant people of Israel, those who still believe and who mourned what was going on at the temple, he comes among them. And he speaks this word that we'll hear then to them. So he comes, he's going to speak to Ezekiel in order that Ezekiel can speak to all those in exile with him. But don't miss the big picture as we go through all those details. The big picture is that God's on the move and that God is present now outside of Jerusalem. And that's a word of judgment. He's abandoned Jerusalem. And yet, what's the mercy? Well, that here he is with his people, with his prophet Ezekiel, who used to be a priest and now is a prophet, and just with the other remnant of the faithful there in Babylon. That's kind of what we want to cover today as we look at this great vision of God. I hope this Bible study, again, has been helpful for you in understanding this book and will continue to go forward in the weeks to come. God's peace be with you. Amen.